Hi, my name is Mark Blackwell, and welcome to the Arkaro Insights podcast series, where we help business-to-business executives deliver better results in their organizations. In each episode, we introduce you to one of our thought partners to bring you the latest ideas for change and innovation in your organization.
If you can answer yes to any of these questions, what you have is probably a goal or a plan, or a collection of goals and plans, or in the worst case, clichés and truisms.
Peter Compo is the author of the Emergent Approach to Strategy, Adaptive Design and Execution. With a doctorate in chemical engineering from the City College of New York and also a musical background, he spent 25 years at DuPont in a wide range of leadership positions, including product, marketing, supply chain, and business management. And he was the corporate lead for integrated business planning. He left the company after 25 years to work full-time on developing the Emergent Approach. His mission is to help organizations achieve a new level of clarity in their strategy and to fully embrace the adaptive view of the world. This episode, we are going to talk about the 5 disqualifiers, the new set of tests of strategy. Hey, welcome back, Pete.
Good to be here.
So, today we're going to talk about another really important bit that comes out of your new book, The Emergent Approach to Strategy. And we're going to talk about the 5 disqualifiers of strategy. Can you just help us understand what are these 5 disqualifiers?
The 5 disqualifiers are a new set of strategy tests that require less prediction and subjectivity than most traditional tests of strategy. And they consist of 5 questions. And they are, is the opposite of the statement you're trying to test absurd? Does the statement include numbers or dates? Is the statement a duplicate of the parent organization? Does the statement exclude anything or anyone in the organization? And is the statement in the form of a list? If you can answer yes to any of these questions, what you have is probably a goal or a plan, or a collection of goals and plans, or in the worst case, clichés and truisms.
You mentioned something about the traditional tests of strategy. Can you just tell me a bit more about what these traditional tests are?
Absolutely. Many traditional tests of strategy are well known. For example, the tests by McKinsey and Michael Porter is associated with some, and most consulting houses have some kind of testing system. Rummelt early on wrote some tests way back in the 70s and the 80s. And one common feature of all the traditional tests is that you need a yes answer to pass. So, for example, do you have sufficient resources to achieve your objectives? Or does your strategy explain what not to do? Or McKinsey's, will your strategy beat the market? So in these cases, a yes means you pass.
Hey, that would be a great one for investing in the stock market, wouldn't you think? If you knew when you're going to beat the market, what have I been missing all of these years?
Well, now you've hit on exactly the problem. If you knew the answer to will my strategy beat the market, you wouldn't need to do any strategizing at all. It's all you'd need to do is state what it is that will beat the market and then go do it and become rich and famous. So this is the problem with many traditional tests. They're extremely subjective. They require a huge amount of prediction. Some are better than others. For example, Porter's question, does your strategy explain what not to do? And does it provide clear trade-offs? These are questions that make great sense. But will your strategy beat the market? Or a question like, is your strategy contaminated by bias? Who's going to stand up in the meeting with the boss and say, excuse me, my strategy's contaminated by bias. I don't, I'm all in the wrong direction, and I ought to be punished. I don't know what the hell they would say, but clearly these tests have issues, and the 5 disqualifiers, with their no answers to pass, move well beyond the subjectivity and the amount of prediction that many traditional tests require. I do have a figure in Chapter 8 where the disqualifiers are introduced in the Emergent Approach, where I show which tests traditionally are better than others and how they can be used to advantage.
For the audience, it'd be great if we could spend a bit of time going through each of these 5 in a little bit more detail. So can we start with the first? And the first, being one of my favourites, is the opposite of the statement absurd.
Yeah, the opposite test, the opposite disqualifier is really powerful. What it says that if you take a statement and flip the word or words that are trying to give guidance to its opposite, if the resulting answer is absurd, what you have is at best an aspiration, a goal, a vision, or a mission. But if it really fails, it's more likely that what you have is a cliche or a truism with no trade-offs, and it's just a statement of the obvious. So take, for example, a very simplistic example. Our strategy is to maximize financial return. Well, the opposite is to minimize financial return, which is clearly absurd. Even a nonprofit wouldn't want to minimize financial return. So because the opposite, minimize financial return, is absurd, it means that the statement maximize financial return cannot be a strategy. And in this case, it is just a worthless cliche. Right
on. Indeed, there are some buzzwords to listen out for. And I'm sure we've heard many of these as we've been sitting in strategy presentations. Words like optimize, drive, improve. That should ring alarm bells then, shouldn't it, I guess?
Absolutely. And don't forget some of the more sophisticated ones. Disrupt. Our strategy is to disrupt, which could have meaning if you're defining disrupt as a Christensen get in with a low price, low performance product and then work your way up, could be a strategy. But how much does disrupt now just mean anything that upends another business or another industry? And don't forget things like advance, accelerate, or the worst of all, our strategy is to transform. These are buzzwords, and the opposite test will draw them out immediately and force you to start writing something more meaningful. I do have a list of these words in Chapter 8 where you can go see the problem. We should say that why is the opposite test true? Well, it's because if the opposite is absurd, it means that a strategy statement will not satisfy the 3 requirements of a strategy: that it be a free choice, that it supply real-time guidance, and that it unify all action. You can show how it derives right from those 3 requirements.
I think you're not the only one who talks about the opposite test. Didn't Roger Martin come up with something similar as well?
Yeah, I wanted to mention 2 other points about the opposite test. The first is that this is the one test on the list that has been used by others, especially Roger Martin, who uses a little different language. He says if the opposite is stupid on its face, but this is trying to express a very similar concept. He just came up with that. I don't think he doesn't really have a model of strategy derivation, and he defines strategy as choices, so we come from a different place, but he has shown great examples of the opposite test. There are others. Fredmund Malik in Germany has it in his book. And I think people naturally use the opposite test. I give examples in the military in my book. And people just naturally know that when a statement has an absurd opposite, it's not saying anything, and people use it naturally. It's almost folk wisdom. The second point I want to make about the opposite is that it can reveal subtle problems with strategy statements. And one in the book that I show is test the strategy. Our strategy is to be low cost. To have low cost. The opposite of that is have high cost, which is absurd. The opposite test, therefore, says that low cost is not a strategy. And this will surprise many people. But the reason is no one would aspire to high cost. It would never be something that would be desired. It would always be absurd. So to transform the intent of low cost or the spirit of that into something that's really a strategy, you need to have something where high cost would be acceptable as a trade-off for something else. For example, high performance or something you can really sell to your customers, for example. And I even give the example of Henry Ford many, many years ago. His strategy wasn't low cost. It was low price to customers and high availability. And low cost had to be done as part of that.
So thanks for that. I'm much clearer now. If we move on to the second one, which is, does the statement include numbers?
Yes. The second test, the second disqualifier, says that if your strategy statement, if your prospective strategy statement that you want to test has numbers in it, it is most likely a goal, some kind of aspiration, and not a strategy. So, for example, our strategy is to increase ROI by 10% in the next 2 years would fail. It is clearly a goal.
Indeed, if I can remember something from the last time, it doesn't hit the basic requirements of strategy, the first requirement of free choice, because try as we might, what is expected of us, we cannot hit the number just by wanting to. It's not within our control.
Absolutely. If it were a free choice to achieve 10% ROI improvement in the next 2 years, well, why not pick 50%? Why not pick 500% in 1 year or 1 month? Of course it gets silly. No future event is a free choice. It also gives very little real-time guidance. So what does that mean I do day to day to increase my ROI by 50%? And the reason why we need the numbers disqualifier is because there's a loophole in the opposite disqualifier. And that is that there is no such thing as an opposite of a number. So if we say the opposite of 10% ROI improvement, there is no opposite. And therefore, the opposite disqualifier wouldn't catch it, even though it usually catches goals that are masquerading as strategies. So we need the numbers to plug this loophole in the opposite test.
Okay, that's good. That makes sense, but I think I've got an exception. So let me just try something with you and see how it goes. We've got a business, and it's got an overloaded customer services department. So it comes up with a strategy, having identified to overcome the bottleneck of a constrained customer services department. Do not seek new customers with an estimated revenue of less than $250,000 per year. Now, this addresses a bottleneck. It's a tough choice because there's a trade-off. You're going to probably lose some new business. But surely you need a number to help define this strategy rule.
You're absolutely right. And what you've identified is the exception to the numbers test, in that if the number is a set point, what I call a set point versus a goal, it can be a valid rule. It can be a valid strategy rule. And what the example you gave is a perfect one. You can know in real time whether or not you are engaging with customers more or less with less or more $250,000 revenue. It also gives real time guidance. You can know now whether you're not doing it. The issue with set point statements to look out for is that usually they will be tactical in nature. Your example might be a strategy, because if that was the real bottleneck, if you were really addressing the overall bottleneck in that business, it could be a strategy. I just think often strategy statements with numbers in them are tactical in nature, meaning they apply to a smaller scope of the entire business or function. This applies to any function, IT, R&D, doesn't matter.
So the next one is the statement a duplicate of the parent organization? Can you help me understand what that one's about?
Yes. So just as background, what do we mean by parent and child organizations? This comes from the concept of nested systems. And that's the term I use to describe the nesting of any larger organization that has different functions within it. So in the kind of the classic sense, you've got a corporation with many business units. Each of those business units is nested under the corporation, and there's a corporate strategy, and then nested strategies underneath of each of the business units. And then you have functional strategies nested under the corporation or the business, IT, R&D, HR, whatever. The whole concept of nested strategies is a very familiar one. The difference in the emergent approach is how how we describe the interaction between the various structures in the organization. And the same as the parent test, disqualifier captures that if for example, a business unit says that their strategy is the same as the corporate strategy, it's not adding any information, because the corporate strategy is in fact a constraint on the business unit, not to be violated. Therefore, just repeating it is a truism and adds no information and is not a valid strategy. The business unit needs to have a strategy that addresses their bottleneck to achieving that corporate constraint.
I think in this regard, you've got something to say about a certain Mr. Jack Welch and his strategy of being number one or number two.
Well, it's kind of fun to go back to the Jack Welch example. What did he said? I want every business in my company to be either number one or two. Now, let's put off for a minute whether or not that is a strategy statement that he put on, or whether it is just a goal. We can talk about that. However, if business unit X, I don't know, the railroad engines or the or the medical products division or the jet engines says our strategy is to be number one or number two in our industry, it is not a strategy. Even if it were on its own a strategy, because it's not adding new information, it's just repeating what's already a constraint on that business unit leader. For them to have a strategy, they would need to discover what's limiting them to achieving being number one or number two in their industry. And it would depend on what's the bottleneck for them to do that. So maybe if in one case a strategy there might be become aggressive with pricing coupled with heavy resources on streamlining the supply chain, for instance. Doesn't matter. But the point is that the disqualifier, the same as the parent, the duplicate of the parent, says any statement that's in the child framework that's identical in the parent framework, you've added no information and you don't have it. It's not a strategy. And this applies for IT as well, or any other group as well. If the head of IT of a company says our strategy is to only use XYZ techniques, and then you look at the business unit IT group and they say our strategy is only to use XY techniques, it's not a strategy because it's a constraint imposed on that IT group. A strategy must be a free choice. It's not a free choice.
So the fourth one is, does the statement exclude anything or anyone in the organization? It sounds a bit obvious, but I think probably a bit more to it than it first appears, I guess.
I think this is one where it's obvious in principle that if you went to somebody and said, does your strategy omit some of your assets and omit some of your people and organizations, they'd look at you like you were, an idiot and say, well, of course it doesn't. But when you actually get down to it, I think it's easy to violate. And the example that I think is good to illustrate this is when you think about products in a business or a corporation, where there are businesses and product lines in dramatically different places in the product life cycle. So you have brand new stuff that's just taking off and it's, you have all high expectations and you're putting lots of money into improving it. And then you have mature, perhaps cash cow businesses that you're just using to generate cash. Now, what if you say your strategy is to do product performance improvement, market-backed product performance improvement? Well, this strategy might apply to a lot of the products, but it certainly wouldn't apply to the cash cow products. Yet I think it would be very easy for a leader to say our strategy is customer-focused product improvement, product performance improvement. So I think this is a subtle one that really requires a diagnosis and soul searching as to whether the strategy truly does run the gamut of the whole business. And the solution would be a nested system where you have a strategy for the cash cows and you have a strategy for the early market life cycle market products, and then an overall corporate strategy above that links the two. For example, something about how the cash is going to be used for the early stage products.
But this is a different issue we're talking about than the one in the last podcast, where we saw the idea that people looking for their name on the chart and strategies can grow into long lists as they try to cover every function, every item. What you're trying to get across here is not that concept, but something different, right?
Well, that's really excellent point, because this is the diversity of needs of a product line, for example, is what leads to, let's say one of the many things that leads to strategy as long lists of sub-goals. We're going to generate cash. We're going to generate cash in our commodity businesses, and we're going to use that cash here. And then in this business, we're going to improve ROI. And in this business, we're going to improve quality. And in this business, we're going to, and so on and so on. Everything's covered. Every life cycle portion is covered. It feels great, and it's not a strategy, as we're going to talk about in a minute. But even a more sophisticated strategy statement can fail this. For example, what if in the example we've been talking about, the corporate comes up with the strategy, we're going to outsource manufacturing and instead put our resources into product performance improvement. That's a meaningful strategy statement. I don't, to know whether it's a good one, you have to really know the business, but that holds water, but not one. It holds water with the opposite test and the opposite disqualifier and numbers. What it doesn't hold water for is that it would not apply to the true cash cow businesses, even though it is a very meaningful statement.
So it's with care. So I think, the conversation is moving on to the last one, and it's, we're segueing quite well here. Is the statement a list as the final disqualifier? So do you have anything to say you'd like to add that we haven't said already?
Yes. Well, first thing I want to say is the opposite disqualifier may be the most wonderful of the five and the most generally applicable, but the list disqualifier is not far behind. If there, in only the rarest of occasions will a strategy be a list of choices, a list of good things to do. We've all seen the paper that says a list of goals is not a strategy. Roger Martin talks about a list of laudable goals or laudable statements. Everybody knows these aren't strategies, and yet almost every strategy I've ever seen is a list of something instead of a statement. And a list usually doesn't unify because the statements aren't necessarily consistent as a whole. If, in fact, a list is very consistent with itself, the R&D aspects, the manufacturing aspects, the choice of channel and product and customer and region are all very consistent, the list wouldn't be the strategy. The strategy would be the rule, the high-level rule, the central rule, the policy that made all those things consistent.
Yeah, I think that's worth emphasizing, Pete, because it's an area where I can see opportunity for confusion, and maybe we can just collect a couple of ideas that we said in the last few minutes. So, yeah, I'm a product line manager, global product line manager, and as you say, I've got different groups of products, some of them old, some of them new, some of them about to hit the market. I'm working in different geographic markets, and in all of these markets, I've got different needs-based segments of customers, and so I've got different tools in terms of price, service, product availability, and I put all of these together in a policy table, something which is a very powerful tool in your book to manage these multi-component choices, right? And I feel that's my product line strategy, that as defined in that policy table. Isn't this basically a list in disguise?
This is a list. And that's why a policy table that outlines things like how we're going to handle product proliferation with different customer segments. How are we going to handle things like expediting for customer segments? How are we going to handle new development for customers, or customizing products for them, or investing in facilities for them? People are familiar with the idea of a policy table, and these are tables of tactics. And there can be many tactics, but they are not strategies. They are tactical rules that need an overall strategy to make them consistent. How would you be able to create a manufacturing strategy? How would manufacturing know what to work on if there wasn't some overarching strategy for the business that explains what they should work on that's consistent with what marketing's working on, or product development, or sales, and whatever?
And along with every strategy, there must be a bottleneck. And that's why it's keep coming back to this point, which I think really helps differentiate your thinking. It's so closely connected with the theory of constraints that if you don't identify the bottleneck, you can't have a strategy. And if the bottleneck changes, or you diagnose the bottleneck to be different, then ergo the strategy must change.
That is right on. And yes, it is aligned with Goldrat's theory of constraints, and that, and his work did not just apply to factories, but he might have begun it with factories and supply chains. Of course, his argument was that unless you debottleneck the number one limiting factor, it doesn't matter what you do elsewhere to throughput or to quality of the factory. And the same goes for any aspect of a business or any organization, Why shouldn't it be the same? Unless you are changing the limiting factor, you can't change the overall system.
So therefore, if I've got a no to a bit of strategy, does that mean I've got a good strategy?
Even if you pass all 5 disqualifiers, say you pass all 5 disqualifiers with flying colors, unfortunately, it does not mean you have a good strategy yet. All it means is that you have a strategy at all. Something functioning as a strategy, a central rule that is free choice, gives real-time guidance, and unifies all decisions and actions. To know whether you've got a great strategy, you've got to work the entire framework. You've got to work in your goals, your plans, your metrics, your diagnosis, your bottlenecks, and so forth. And you do that using a strategy alternative matrix. But don't take this to mean that the disqualifiers aren't enormously helpful, because the first step to getting a great strategy is getting a strategy at all.
So how did you come to develop these tests?
I found them just by thinking about strategy, and they evolved over the years. Like we've said, the opposite test is out there, Roger Martin and others. 20 years ago, I remember, maybe 25 years ago, sitting in a big DuPont meeting and people stating goals as strategies. And I remember just blurting out, well, as opposed to what? Grow 20% through excellence in whatever, as opposed to what? Shrink with incompetence? It just kind of comes to you when you're frustrated with the platitudes that are substituted for strategy. The others just came to me over time as I developed the theory. And in fact, what really brought them together was that as I developed the theory of the influence diagram-based model of complex adaptive systems, and where I was able to derive the killer problems of innovation and therefore the 3 requirements of a strategy, it turns out that the disqualifiers came technically, theoretically out of that model. So it was kind of a long evolution, just like I describe any business growing or any technology, and they are a little technology in their own.
So Pete, many thanks. Really useful. Really enjoyed talking to you. I've been aware of your ideas for many years, but every time we get back together, something else comes to mind, and I find it very useful. And I loved in that final example, once again, you really emphasized the importance of bottlenecks in designing strategy and identifying the bottleneck with the emergent approach. So perhaps, I don't know how your schedule's looking, maybe we could talk about identifying bottlenecks in our next podcast?
I think that sounds great.
Super. Thank you again, Pete. Really appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Arkaro Insights podcast. Whilst we put together the next episode, why not pop over to the Arkaro website, www.arkaro.com, or follow Arkaro on LinkedIn for the latest news.